All right, to speak more on this and other political stories, let's now welcome political analyst Lukhona Mnguni. Lukhona, thank you so much for your time and, of course, good afternoon to you. Perhaps before we speak about the accusations leveled against Panyaza Lesufi, and there are a lot, I want to get your sense then on the ANC's reflections of the Government of National Unity yesterday. I mean, we heard from President Cyril Ramaphosa essentially saying that people should judge the GNU based on its work and not necessarily on political parties. There was, of course, that big question with the SACP snubbing, seemingly, the 100 days reflection of the GNU. Just your observations.
Well, Unati, a very good afternoon and a good afternoon to your viewers. I suppose yesterday was an interesting event. As you say, President Ramaphosa made mention that he's not celebrating the GNU, but he's actually, reflecting on the 100 days of this government of national unity, which is inclusive of 10 political parties. And I think that for the ANC, it's also important for them to have a political program outside of the government of national unity. In actual fact, I've been reflecting with some friends and academics to say that it's important for politicians and political parties to avoid what we term dilution, so being diluted by participating in the government of national unity. As the president, I think, emphasized that the successes of the GNU will be the successes of the GNU and not necessarily just of one political party over the other. But he made mention and was actually quite robust to say that the political program of the ANC as embodied in its manifesto is now the political program of the government of national unity. I think there was a bit of an overstretch insofar as that is a lot of wishful thinking in my belief, because we do know that there are actually some schisms that exist between the two major political parties to this, grand coalition, or the ANC and the DA. There are a number of issues where they disagree. He made mention of two, which is the Bella Act and the NHI Act. But there are other fundamental societal outlooks where these parties differ, for example, around questions of labor laws. We know that the DA often laments the labor laws of this country as causing, a disincentive for investors into the economy and therefore economic growth. The ANC definitely does not agree with that, particularly, no doubt, at the time of the passing of the First Minister of Labour, Tito Mboweni. So I think, Unati, it was an interesting event, but probably more politics rather than substance.
Yeah. Let's now get into the crux of the matter. Of course, the DA taking its fight now into provincial level in Gauteng. I mean, the Premier of Gauteng and also ANC Chair Panyaza Lesufi facing credibility attacks, it would seem, from the DA, Freedom Front Plus and AfriForum. And they're now also calling on President Ramaphosa to act, as these tensions are also spilling over onto X platform. I mean, what do you then make of these developments, especially since ANC Secretary General Fikile Mbalula and Lesufi have also been at loggerheads over the GNU specifically? And I mean, we've just heard now from Soli Msimang saying that 58 forensic reports are yet to be essentially, while Panyaza Lesufi is yet to then just release these reports. But what do you then make of these political squabbles? Are they political squabbles, or is, Panyaza Lesufi's credibility on the line here?
Well, I think in the first instance, the DA in Gauteng is quite flat-footed and is trying to find political relevance and reimagine itself and re-image itself as, the official opposition in the province of Gauteng. Remember, they've been waiting on the sidelines, unwilling to upset the apple cart, as it were, because they were probably hopeful they would at some point eventually be part of the government of the coalition in Gauteng. And it seems that, that ship has sailed, particularly if you see and listen to the remarks made by the Deputy President of the ANC yesterday in the build-up of that reflection of the 100 days of GNU, Unati, when Paul Mashatile made mention that, if the DA doesn't cooperate in Gauteng, then Panyaza and the ANC must go ahead. And they wish that the problems of Gauteng do not become the problems of the government nationally, because nationally they are working quite all right. So I do find that the DA in Gauteng probably feels somewhat isolated left behind by events and therefore needs to catch up. Because as you are saying, some of the reports that they are talking about, if you listen to the timelines, 2016 to date, are timelines that would have occurred under the leadership of, before even Panyaza Lesufi. But one may want to ask a different question. During the negotiations, what was the DA posture to the ANC about these reports in making sure that as they come into the Gauteng provincial government, they would not be tainted by being part of an establishment that sits on this kind of reports that they make mention to, be hiding corruption and involving Panyaza Lesufi in corruption. We do know, particularly during COVID-19, when the now Premier was the then MEC of Education, there were a number of shenanigans and issues that did come up that needed and, ought to have been thoroughly investigated. And it will be important to go back to that era and see how far things have come. But you also talk about how much of a headache is this for the ANC. I think for the ANC, there seems to be a developing consensus that, whatever is happening in Gauteng will not affect the national government and the leadership of President Ramaphosa. And it may well be that what is happening in Gauteng is actually becoming what I call the first signpost of the roadmap towards 2027 December conference of the ANC, where some grouping of people will coalesce around the posture of the ANC in Gauteng to buy themselves insurance, from the narratives of the GNU and working with the DA or resisting working with the DA. And Panyaza Lesufi is emerging along with Solima Pailar of the SACP, probably as the poles of attraction for these anti-GNU forces and sentiments. What is important about Panyaza, as detailed by Mbalula in one of his press briefings yesterday, is that Panyaza is actually, a leader of the ANC. And so it's a bit different for him. So if he is too disagreeable to a point that he might be breaking the code of conduct of the ANC, it may well invite the wrath of the leadership of the ANC for him to be disciplined. So I suppose internally there's going to be some indications of the political direction towards the inheritance of the political leadership of the ANC, because come 2027 December, we know that the ANC will have a new president.
And just on that last point, I mean, I'm glad you mentioned, of course, the roadmap to that elective conference. Yesterday, also, the Deputy President, Paul Mashatile of the ANC, of course, seemed to sidestep questions about, the succession in the ANC, calling the debate about who will succeed, Cyril Ramaphosa premature at this stage. I mean, when you consider, as you rightfully say, that 2027 is actually not that far off, I mean, these shenanigans that we are seeing, as some have called it, how will they then play out in 2027? And will they be the deal breaker in as far as where the ANC chooses to go now with the GNU?
Well, look, Unati, I think for any sensible politician in the ANC, they would know exactly how vulnerable the party is. I mean, it has just lost an election for the first time since 1994. And the government of national unity, quote unquote, is gaining enough traction within society and in some spaces. And they are really doing well in terms of their PR of selling this as the best formula that could have happened post the 29 May elections. It would then be very premature to overlay that success or that traction that they are gaining in government with squabbles within the ANC. In actual fact, it probably would be best for the ANC to postpone any of these ructions playing out in the public domain as much as possible, which is why I've even, in some instances posited that it may well even be, ill-advised for the ANC to go to a National General Council next year, which some people are hoping that they will use, as some did in 2005. As a precursor to the national conference, to fight internal squabbles and, of course, becoming more inward looking rather than looking at the broader picture. And I think that an ANC that can manage its internal affairs, appear to be coherent and managing succession much more soberly than it has done in the past, is what will probably make some of its supporters regain confidence in the ANC. But an ANC that, eats itself alive in the public domain with people pulling in different directions because they are solving for their own self-interest rather than the broader good of the organization, I think that will be an ANC in perpetual decline.
And I mean, I just want to sneak this one last question in, Lukhona, in as far as other parties that are not necessarily within the GNU, looking at, how they're reacting to what we are seeing today. I mean, we heard Action SA saying that all it needs is accountability because as it stands, the GNU can't provide that because, as you rightfully also put it, they are all about self-service and not necessarily looking after the interests of the country. But what are their strategies at the moment as they are looking at these developments?
I think that a number of political parties that are outside the GNU, save for those with a larger voice like Umkhonto weSizwe Party and to an extent the Economic Freedom Fighters, but the remainder of the parties, Action SA, ACDP, ATM, UAT, and so on, and I think they've got a mammoth battle for survival in their own hands, because what the GNU does, Unathi, in my view, and I've been consistent at this, is that it creates what I term politics of visibility and invisibility. So if you're not in the GNU, you are actually becoming invisible, particularly in the discourse of national politics, because you now have 10 political parties that are playing prominent roles, either as ministers, deputy ministers, and chairpersons of significant portfolio committees in parliament, whereas your party has nothing. And I think it's for this reason that a party like Action SA realized that whilst it might play this self-righteous, role at a national level, it does in Gauteng, where its core base of support remains, need to play its hand even much more. And that's why they've got a speaker in the city of Johannesburg and now an executive mayor in the city of Tshwane. So you might want to ask yourself then, Unathi, how much of that opposition to the GNU really is material or is optics? In an instance where Action SA needed to be voted into office by the ANC, both in the city of Johannesburg and in the city of Tshwane.
Lukhona, thank you so much for your time. A pleasure to have you on the show. Lukhona Mnguni is a political analyst, of course, just weighing in on what we are seeing on the political front.